welcome back. This is another important session. In today's video, I'm going to discuss 20 very important give reasons from the short story, The Story of an Hour, written by Kate Chopin. Complete the following sentences by providing a reason for each. Question 1. We all know that we must write a single reason in our own words, and the reason must include all the main points mentioned in the text. Question 1. Great care was taken to break to Mrs. Mallard as gently as possible the news of her husband's death, because the very first line of this story, you will have to take the reference from there. The reason is because Mrs. Mallard had a weak heart. This is important. You must mention this. Mrs. Mallard had a weak heart, and Josephine knew that bad news would overwhelm her sister and worsen her condition. So here there are three important points. Weak heart of Mrs. Mallard, Josephine's knowledge that the bad news, the news of her husband's sudden demise would overwhelm Mrs. Mallard, and number 3, this would worsen her condition and make her even more sick. Question 2 now. Josephine tells Mrs. Mallard as calmly as possible that her husband had been killed in a train accident and uses broken sentences, veiled hints, because she is concerned about her sister's well-being. She is concerned, important, she is concerned, and is apprehensive that the bad news may worsen her heart ailment. So more or less both the reasons are the same, but you must learn how to adapt your answers to specific questions. Adjust your style. You know everything, you need to read the question and just fit in the points according to the question available. Now, 3. Brentley Mallard's friend Richards hastened to deliver the sad news of Brentley Mallard's death because he did not want anybody else to deliver the sad news to Mrs. Mallard bluntly. He wanted to do it himself because he also knew that Mrs. Mallard was sick. Next, question 4. Mrs. Mallard did not hear the sad news, as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance, because I have taken this from the text. So again, read the text, you will know the reason. Because she wept into Josephine's arms with sudden, wild abandonment and reacted strongly. Her reaction was not the same as other women. She reacted strongly, shattering the stereotypical sexist expectations of the 19th century. So in the 19th century, women were considered to be passive, meek and docile. So if such a situation arose that a woman's husband died, it was expected that she would react very passively. She would hear the news with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. But unlike many women, Mrs. Mallard wept into Josephine's arms with sudden, wild abandonment. So you must mention these points in your reason. Question 5. After her initial sobs of grief subside, Mrs. Mallard escapes into her bedroom and locks her door because she wants to be alone with her grief, and this is perhaps the first indication towards freedom, especially in regards to the handling of her own emotions. This loneliness will provide her with an opportunity to seek inwards into her subconscious mind where there were many repressed desires. She had always wanted to be free, to enjoy a life of freedom. But since she was in this institution of marriage, she was controlled by her husband. I hope I have made myself clear, and if you want a better understanding of the text, you can always check the pinned comment section for my easy explanatory video of the story of an hour. Go through all our videos and things will become very easy. Trust me. We have MCQs, explanatory videos. Just check the playlist and listen to our sessions. Question 6. Alone, Mrs. Mallard falls into a comfortable armchair placed before an open window because she is absolutely drained by her own anguish and haunted by exhaustion. Physically, she is weak. Physically, she is now tired, exhausted, and mentally also, she is drained by her own anguish. 7. There was something coming to Mrs. Mallard and she was waiting for it fearfully. Here the word fearfully is very, very important because she was trying hard to resist the feeling approaching her, was unable to articulate the nature of the sensation and was apprehensive of its implications. So it was too subtle and elusive to name. The feeling was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky. So this feeling, this repressed desire of being free was there in her subconscious mind. And after the death of her husband, suddenly all these feelings were making themselves felt. And Mrs. Mallard initially was unable to grasp the meaning of what was happening to her. So this was a brief moment of transition, and soon she will experience a brief moment of illumination. All these things are there in your text. I'm just explaining them. You need to know the context of the 19th century in order to understand this story. 8. Mrs. Mallard's bosom rose and fell tumultuously when she was alone in the room because she was excited emotionally. She was excited, and why? Because she was beginning to grasp the feeling. Now, after the initial hesitation and fear, she was beginning to grasp the feeling, beginning to grasp the feeling. Very, very important. That is sensation of freedom which had been repressed, that was approaching to possess her. So this new sensation was possessing her and she was trying hard to keep it away. Mrs. Mallard's eyes stay keen and bright, heart pulses faster and blood rushes through her body. But this only relaxes her. This doesn't worsen her condition, this relaxes her. Why? Because her physical excitement has now been reframed as an indication of her happiness. She is happy, and this is reflecting in her relaxation, her composure. Again, because her physical excitement has now been reframed as an indication of her happiness regarding her new independent life, and the fearful state of mind has turned into one of enlivened vigor. She is filled with vigor and vitality. She wants to live a long life now. She wants to live a life on her own terms, and she is enjoying this moment. Question 10. Mrs. Mallard did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her, because a clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial, as insignificant. So I have taken this, I have written this from the text. Trivial means insignificant. Mrs. Mallard knows that she will inevitably experience grief when she sees her husband's dead body, yet she spreads her arms to the new life of freedom because. Why? Because she sees beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years. You need to mention this, a long procession of years that will belong to her absolutely, when she can make her own choices and live for herself for the first time without being stifled, without being choked by the institution of marriage. So this is the question and the reason. All the words in this reason are important. You need to mention each and every word. So read, go through it, and now I am moving on to the next question. Mrs. Mallard kept whispering that her body and soul were free because. She was repeating, free, body and soul free. Why? Because she realized that she would no longer be subjected to the powerful rules and norms of marriage. She was leading a life of suffocation, a suffocating life in the institution of marriage. She was unhappy, and now that her husband was dead, she realized that she would no longer be subjected to the powerful rules and norms of marriage and was possessed by an intense sense of self-assertion. Self-assertion, the key word here. This has to be there in your reason. Self-assertion, a newfound identity. She will become Louis from Mrs. Mallard. She will shed her identity as a married woman. So again, another relevant reason. Quickly, number 13 now. Josephine kneels outside the room and begs her sister through the keyhole to open the door because she was worried that Louis will make herself sick by staying alone in her bedroom. A doting sister, a dutiful sister, she was worried, but by doing so, she was being overprotective. Actually, ironically, she was trying to control her emotional response, Mrs. Mallard's emotional response. She also considered Mrs. Mallard as passive, weak, meek and docile, just like most other women of the 19th century. Most other women, not all of them. Keep that in mind. Question 14 now. Louis tells Josephine to go away and that she is not making herself ill because she keeps her joy to herself. She wants to enjoy this moment of illumination, of reawakening, this new life of hers. She keeps her joy to herself, number one, and revels, enjoys in the idea that her new life of freedom is totally and completely her own. She is her own mistress, number two. And number three, and Josephine's overprotective worry is interfering with her emotional process. There are three parts here, three subparts in a single reason. And this is how you can write a compact reason. Go through it. And now 15. Louis' fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her because she was overjoyed. Overjoyed, very important. She was overjoyed thinking about the days that would be her own. She would live for herself without being subjugated to the will of another person, in this case her husband. Her repressed desires are now making themselves felt. In the 19th century, independence was a forbidden pleasure for women. Louis breathed a quick prayer that life might be long because after the sudden demise of her husband, she was completely free and she would live for herself. She was enjoying the moment and therefore she breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she thought with a shudder that life might be long because, ironical, because in the 19th century, women were expected to live under the financial and social control of their husbands, and Mrs. Mallard too was in such a relationship and was unhappy. She did not want to continue in this kind of a situation. Therefore, she thought with a shudder that life might be long. But after the death of her husband, she was praying that indeed life might be long and she might enjoy her newfound freedom. Question 18. Louis's eyes are alight with a feverish triumph, and she carries herself like a kind of goddess because, just add herself, because the intense sensation of self-assertion owing to her new life of freedom fills her with joy, number 1, number 2, confidence, number 3, power, despite Josephine's overprotective nature. She is a confident woman. Self-assertion is another important term you need to mention here. So, self-assertion, power, confidence and joy. If all these points are there in your reason, you will get full marks. No worries at all. 19. Brently Mallard was amazed at Josephine's piercing cry because he had been far away from the scene of accident, did not even know there had been one, and was surprised to see the strange reaction of Josephine. Why was she behaving in such a way? He was completely unaware of the things happening back at home. Richards was too late because Louis Mallard died as soon as she saw her husband, perhaps because of her weak heart and her intense emotional upheaval on seeing her husband alive, shattering her hopes of a life of freedom. The most important point is he was late because he could not save Louis Mallard. She died.